They called him a ghost. For more than 30 years, he moved through the dark, silent, cruel, and unseen. He left behind women's bodies in rice fields, and sometimes he left something worse, a message, not a confession, not an apology, a riddle, the kind that made police question if they were being hunted too. This wasn't just a killer, this was someone who played with the truth. And when he was finally unmasked in 2019, what he said chilled the entire country. It started like a sad story that no one wanted to believe. In the small town of Hwaseong, south of Seoul, a woman's body was found in a rice field. It was September 1986. She had been tied up with her own clothes. Her hands were bruised, and the rain was still falling when police arrived. She was 21 years old. Her name was Lee Wan-im. At first, police thought this was an isolated crime, a tragedy, yes, but not part of something larger. They questioned her boyfriend, her friends, even the farmers who worked nearby. But no one had seen anything. And something else was missing too, a motive. No robbery, no clear reason, just cruelty. That was the beginning. And we didn't know it yet, but it wasn't going to stop. 2 months later, another woman disappeared. Her name was Park Hyun-suk. She was 25 years old. She had been walking home from the bus stop, just like the first victim. Same area, same time of night. And when her body was found again in a rice field, it was almost identical. She had also been tied with her own clothes. She had also suffered deeply before death. And again, no one saw anything. Now police started connecting the dots. This wasn't a one-time crime. This was the beginning of something much darker. They set up roadblocks. They handed out flyers. They knocked on every door in Hwaseong. More than 100 officers were assigned, but it was like chasing smoke. Every time they got close, he vanished. So here's the question. How does someone kill again and again in the same area without ever being seen? By 1987, the community was living in fear. Women were terrified to walk alone. Parents warned their daughters not to go outside at night. Police presence was everywhere. And then came the third message, not on paper, but on a victim's body. One of the victims had a strange piece of fabric tied around her neck, knotted in a very specific way. When detectives studied it, they noticed something odd. The knot, it was military style, like something you'd learn in basic training. But more than that, it looked like a message. The way the knot twisted, the way it folded, it was almost like a riddle. And the killer knew they would see it. He wanted them to. That's when people started to wonder. Was he trying to talk to the police? Or was he mocking them? By the fourth killing, panic had fully taken over Hwaseong. It was no longer whispers behind closed doors. It was public fear heavy, choking. Women carried knives. Men started escorting their wives and daughters everywhere. And the media, once quiet about the story, couldn't stay silent anymore. But something changed with the fourth victim. She wasn't a young woman this time. She was 71 years old, and she had also been tied the same way. That shattered any theory that the killer had a type. Now it looked like anyone could be next. Age didn't matter. Nothing mattered except that you were walking alone at night near the rice fields. Police began door-to-door DNA sweeps. They even tested hundreds of taxi drivers, soldiers, and locals. But it was useless. And then he left his first real message. Not just a knot. Not just a clue. A note. It came in a small envelope sealed tight. It was handwritten shaky but deliberate. There was no name, no return address, just words. Try to find me, but I already know your names. You look for me in the dark, but I am the one holding the flashlight. Police didn't release this to the public at first. They were scared not just of panic, but of what it meant. This man was watching them. He was playing with them. And it wasn't the only letter they would receive. But here's where it gets chilling. The letter was written in pencil. No fingerprints, no smudges, nothing. He was careful, very careful, but also proud. Have you ever heard of a killer who wanted to be caught just not yet? A few weeks later, a woman answered her phone late at night. The voice on the other end was calm, soft, even. He said, "I know what time you get off work. I saw you last night. The red coat looks better than the blue one." She froze. She had never told anyone she bought a red coat. Only one person had seen her, the clerk at the shop. That woman became the next victim. Her red coat was never found. Police traced the call. It came from a phone booth 1 block away from the woman's home, just minutes before the attack. This wasn't just a hunter anymore. This was someone who watched, followed, and waited, like a shadow that decided when to become real. And the real question now, why was he doing it? Because as more clues emerged, it became clear this wasn't random. It was planned. The killer had now claimed 5 lives. 5 women, all different ages, backgrounds, routines, all tied, all left in the same haunting setting, the open fields. One survivor briefly came forward. She had fought off a man who attacked her at night. She scratched his face. She said he wore gloves and smelled like oil. She never saw his face, but she remembered the silence. He didn't curse. He didn't grunt. He didn't say a single word. Just breathing, controlled, almost trained. Police built a profile. They guessed he was in his 30s, strong, possibly military. They even brought in psychologists. The result? This man wants control, one expert said. But he also wants to scare not just the women in the country. Still, no one could picture him. No one had a description. No camera, no prints. It was like he wore the night itself. By 1988, the murders had reached 10. 10 lives taken in less than 3 years, each more brutal than the last. But this next part, it left everyone stunned. When investigators studied the timeline, they noticed something shocking. Many of the murders happened exactly 30 days apart, almost like a ritual. But it went deeper than that. The killer was also choosing victims on rainy nights, always after 9 p.m., always near the fields, always within walking distance of a bus stop. It wasn't random, it was mapped. A huge task force, over 1 million officers involved over time, tried to trap him. They dressed up as couples. They hid in trees. They monitored the fields with heat sensors. But he never showed up. And each time the month passed without an attack, they feared it more, because the next one was always worse than a break, or at least they thought it was. In 1991, a man named Hwaseong was arrested. He was accused of one of the Hwaseong murders, the 8th victim. He confessed, he was convicted, and sentenced to life in prison. But something didn't sit right. He was physically disabled, partially blind in one eye, no military training, no violent history. And he denied the confession just days after giving it, saying it was forced. But the police, desperate for a win, closed the case. They declared the Hwaseong serial murders as mostly solved. The killings stopped. Or maybe the killer just moved on, watched the news, and smiled. Now ask yourself, if the real killer was still out there, what would make him finally speak? After Yoon Sung-yeo's arrest in 1991, the killings in Hwaseong stopped, at least the ones with the same pattern, and so the case faded. Police quietly archived the files. The media turned to other tragedies, and the families of the victims were left with questions no one could answer. Was it really over? Had they caught the right man? Or had they just scared the real killer into stopping? For years, the town tried to forget. New buildings went up. Bus stops were replaced. The rice fields started to feel safe again. But in the homes of the families, the pain never faded. And somewhere, maybe close, maybe far, the real killer was alive, free, watching. Fast forward to 2019. Nearly 30 years after the murders, a detective named Moon Kwang-ho decided to reopen the files. Not because he had to, because he couldn't let it go. He pulled out a box labeled Case File Hwaseong. Inside were yellowed folders, old photographs, and one tiny plastic envelope. Inside it, a single hair. DNA had advanced. In 1991, that sample meant nothing. But in 2019, it could speak. Detectives sent it for analysis. They didn't expect much. After all, the sample was degraded, old, dirty. But then the call came. A match. A name. Someone already in prison for another crime. And when they heard who it was, they went cold. His name was Lee Chun-ye, a man in his 50s sitting in a high-security prison, serving a life sentence for the rape and murder of his sister-in-law in 1994. But the DNA didn't lie. That one hair matched to multiple Hwaseong crime scenes. Not just one, but at least 3. When they told him, Lee didn't flinch. He just looked up and said, "Why did it take you so long?" And then he started to talk. Calm, cold, with zero emotion. "I did it," he said. "All of it, and more." Now think about this. How does a man confess to some of the worst crimes in the country's history? With a face that barely changes. What kind of person does that? When detectives sat across from Lee Chun-yi, they expected a battle. Denial, excuses, resistance. But they got none of that. Lee spoke slowly, like he was reading a list from memory. He confessed to the murder of Lee Wan-im, Park Hyun-suk, and then another, and another. In total 14 murders. Most of them women, one just 13 years old. The way he described each one, unshaken, like it didn't affect him. He remembered what they were wearing, where he followed them, what they said before it happened, and even worse, how he felt nothing afterward. He didn't cry, didn't smile, didn't pause. He wasn't proud. He wasn't ashamed. He was just empty. And here's the question that hit everyone in that room. How can someone live a normal life, raise a family, go to work, with something that dark living inside them? During questioning, Lee casually mentioned something no one expected. He said he used to write letters, not just to police, to the families, to the press, to random addresses chosen from phone books. Some were filled with riddles, some were threats, some were just nonsense. He said it wasn't about sending a message, it was about control. He wanted people to be afraid even when he wasn't there, even after the crimes stopped. Fear to him was power. Investigators found fragments of these letters. Old, dusty envelopes stored in boxes no one had opened in decades. And in one of them, a line that echoed back to the very first letter. "You chase me in the dark, but I hold the light." Lee said that line meant nothing, but detectives knew better. It meant everything. And then came the moment no one wanted to face. The man who had spent years in prison, Yoon Sung-yeol, had been innocent all along. Lee Chun-yi confessed to that murder too. Same victim, same date, same details only the killer could know. It shattered what little trust remained in the original investigation. Yoon had spent decades behind bars for something he never did. He lost his youth, his health, his reputation. And now all they could offer him was an apology. When asked how he felt, Yoon said, "I never hated the man who did it. I hated the people who didn't listen." And the public, they erupted with anger at the system, at the silence, at the fact that for 30 years, the real killer was right there. So here's what we ask now. How many more lives would have been saved if they had just listened sooner? After the confession, psychologists were brought in to study Lee Chun-yi. They wanted answers not just to what he did, but why. What kind of person commits 14 murders and then lives like nothing ever happened? What they found was terrifying. Lee showed no signs of guilt, no signs of empathy. He didn't see his victims as people. He saw them as objects, things that gave him a rush. And once they were gone, he moved on like they were never real. He told the experts, "I didn't feel anything. Not then, not now. People die, that's all." They ran every test available. The result, psychopathy. Complete emotional detachment. But more than that, manipulation. He had studied people, watched them, predicted their moves. This wasn't just a man who killed. This was someone who planned, practiced, and perfected it over time. And the scariest part, if he hadn't killed his sister-in-law in 1994, he might never have been caught. With Lee's confession came national headlines. Apologies were issued. Yoon Song-yeol was officially exonerated. The police held public statements admitting their mistakes. But for the victims' families, justice didn't feel like justice. There were no trials, no chance to face him in court. The statute of limitations for the Hwaseong murders had already expired. Legally, he couldn't be punished for those crimes. All they had was his word and some DNA. For the families who buried daughters, mothers, sisters, it wasn't enough. One mother said, "He took her from us in the rain, and now he sits in prison eating, breathing, sleeping while she lies in the ground." Is that justice? The country mourned again, not because it was new, but because they realized the wounds had never healed. In one final interview, Lee Chun-yi was asked a simple question. "Why are you telling us all this now?" He smiled, not a big smile, just a flicker, and said, "Because no one ever beat me. I ended it on my terms." It was never about guilt. It was about control until the very end. He wanted the last word, and he got it. But as he walked back to his prison cell, one officer noticed something strange. Lee paused, looked at a window, and whispered something. When asked what he said, he replied, "I wonder if they still remember me." He didn't mean the police. He meant the victims. And that's the haunting thought. In the end, this man didn't want to be forgotten. He wanted to be feared, remembered, talked about. And now we are. After Lee Chun-yi's confession, the rice fields of Hwaseong became something else entirely. They were no longer just part of the landscape. They were a memorial, a graveyard without names. People left flowers where the bodies were found. Some came just to cry. Others came to stand in silence, as if listening for something that could never be heard again. But for many, especially those who grew up during the time of the killings, the fear had never really left. They remembered locking their windows every night. They remembered the radio warnings. They remembered their mothers walking them home, clutching their hands just a little too tightly. Lee had haunted the town not just through his crimes, but through the way he made people question everyone. Every stranger on the street, every shadow at the bus stop, every knock on the door. And even after all the answers were finally revealed, people still whispered. Was there more? Were there victims we never knew about? Was he really done when the murders stopped? Or had he just gotten better at hiding? That's the terrible power of someone like Lee Chun-yi. He doesn't just kill people, he kills peace. And once that peace is gone, sometimes it never fully comes back. It's easy to talk about the killer. It's easy to study him, quote him, even fear him. But the real story, the one that deserves to be remembered, isn't his. It's theirs. Lee Wan-in, Park Hyun-suk, Hong Jin-young, Kim Ma-young, Shim Yoon-ha. Girls, women, daughters, mothers, sisters, all taken by someone who believed their lives could be erased. But they weren't. In 2022, a permanent memorial was built in Hwaseong. Not a statue, not a museum, just a quiet space with a wall and on it the names, not of the killer, but of every victim. People visit, some light candles, some leave poems, some just sit and weep. And near the edge of that memorial, someone once carved words into the wooden bench. It says, he tried to make them disappear, but now we say their names louder than his. That is how the story ends, because the truth is no matter how long it takes. Even the darkest secrets get pulled into the light. And monsters, they always leave footprints, even if it takes 30 years to follow them. If this case haunted you like it haunted me, don't forget to hit subscribe. We've got more dark truths to uncover.